Yeah, because at a certain point, heart rate for busy athletes began to make a little bit more sense, even with all its inherent drawbacks of, bad night's sleep, poor hydration, stressed, fatigued, all affecting heart rate. But we were led to believe that power was a step change. It's an improvement when we all moved to power meters. But the problem was, I would head out the door on a Saturday to do by 2 by 20 threshold and sit at 380 watts at a perceived effort of 7.5, 8 out of 10. But on a Tuesday evening after a long day in college and commuting, I would try and sit at the same intensity and I'd blow my lights in. With inside 4 minutes, perceived efforts 9.5, 10 out of 10, can't hold the wattage is sliding. So a lot of people then were left with, do I default back to rate of perceived exertion and ride this as an 8 out of 10 effort? Do I default back to heart rate even knowing its inbuilt limitations? And we're left a little bit uncertain. Do you see respiration as being a solution to this problem?
It's yeah, it's definitely part of the solution because we see that when we look at minute ventilation, for example, so the airflow in and out of the lungs, it stays much closer to the true effort that you're trying to do, independent of heart rate or power. So if you there's a nice study that was done a couple of years back where they by Ed Monders and Dan Plews, they had these subjects go through I think a 1 or 2 hour kind of VT1, which would be like kind of your top of zone two, so endurance pace type of a ride, and they tested the power, ventilation, and heart rate associated with that first threshold, ventilatory threshold one, uh, before and after, and they found that ventilation stayed consistent before and after. So there was no apparent effect on the ventilation response, but there was a about a I think it was like a 10-15% increase in heart rate and about a 10-15% drop in power. And what that tells us is that fatigue there and the stress of the workout that even though it was a low intensity workout, the stress induced or possibly slight dehydration. We don't really there any number of the factors that you mentioned could have been contributing on the heart rate side, and then the fatigue setting in as you're kind of working your muscles and over that period of time impacts the power associated with the thing that you're trying to target. Uh, so ventilation seems to be, and we're seeing this also in the data from our users across the board, from the top of the world tour down to kind of your casual athletes. It's a much truer signal of the effort that you're trying to produce in order to elicit the
Brilliant.
change that you're trying to produce.
So when I get that cardiac drift on a zone two ride, so 220-watt ride, 5 hours, 120 beats for the start of the ride, then I try my best to stay on top of, using as much as can an athlete's kitchen hexes, whatever, to plan out my fueling, stay on top of my hydration, work on efficiency, whatever that means to some people. But I inevitably have this decoupling of heart rate and power as the ride
Hmm.
goes on.
Yeah.
Heart rate rises for a constant power. Does a ventilatory threshold become like a moving target that adjusts downwards as I fatigue during this ride?
Well, it gives you that ceiling uh, to have as your target, and so you can, when you have the ventilation on your bike computer, you can allow the power and heart rate to do what they naturally will do, whether it's to drop the power, to allow the heart rate to drift, um, it, by controlling the ventilation, controlling to the ventilation. And so it really becomes so the fact that the heart rate is drifting is actually very interesting. It's a signal. And we would expect that to change depending on a number of circumstances and fitness level and progression of fitness level and durability and so forth. And we would expect the power at that effort to drop less over time. So if you're progressing, you can imagine if you're just starting out, maybe 2 hours is gonna you're gonna have to drop your watts, 15, 20 watts, and then as you and heart rate might have drifted, 10, 15 beats, and then as you gain fitness, 3 hours, it's going to cause that same response. 4 hours is going to cause that same response. But when you go back to in that 3 hour ride, you go back to the 2 hours, you're much more stable. And so that's actually a signal that your body is adapting in a positive way. And there are acute things that can change that, on a day-to-day basis, but over the long run, that's the trend we want to see. And so when we have ventilation, we can much better control for the thing we're trying to control for, and allow these other things to tell us what it's actually telling us, that no, I'm actually getting fatigued. My durability is not greater than this, or no, now my durability has actually improved by this much, and so on and so forth. So it allows us to use those metrics in what we think is the way that they were meant to be used, not as the thing to control for, but the thing to actually see how our body's responding to the thing we're trying to control for.
Yeah, because we've been led to believe that there's a fixed basket of physiological adaptations that are in each of these zones. And each of the zones are like stepping off the edge of a cliff. If you step out of your threshold from zone 2 to zone 1, now you don't get the associated benefits from zone 2. So if I'm in hour 5, even if my perceived effort has gone up and the bottom of my zone 2 is 200 watts, I don't want to ride home at 160 watts because I've been programmed to believe that riding home at 160 watts isn't the goal I set out to achieve. I'm not getting the basket of adaptations that I set out to achieve if I drop below that.
Well, yeah, so I think there are a few really nice ways to think about this. So one is managing your stress, the stress on your body, as you train, and I think one of the key things is the consistency with which you can apply stress on the body in a manageable way, and you sort of string together a series of days and weeks and months of really good training. That's going to, if you can manage that, then that's going to produce really good results. And then it's the spectrum of stressors that produce a result. And I think I got this from Steven Seiler, and I'm not sure he got it from somewhere else, but Steve, they call it this bow tie mechanism for stress in something happening in the middle, and then the results happening on the back end of the physiological adaptations that happen. And so a lot of there's a whole range of stressors that can create the same responses. And the key thing, so you can think of like low stress over long periods of time, high stress over short periods of time. They go into this like bundle of stuff that's changing and adapting your body to those stressors, and out come these results, improving your fitness, improving your durability, and all these things. And the key thing is to manage that stress going in, and in order to be able to string together those series of weeks, days, and months and years of training effectively, without burning out, without overtraining, without injury, and so forth.
Like, does it
And
open up a
so,
new frontier of coaching for us? Because as you're talking, I'm wondering, because it's the first time we can begin to understand and have truly individualized plans. We can begin to understand why I got an adaptation from that training block and you didn't.
exactly. So breathing gives us that sort of that view into, and it's great when we triangulate all of them together, breathing, heart rate, and power. But it finally allows us to kind of see a much clearer picture of the stress that we're placing on the person. So the way I think about it, like ventilation gives us the individualized zones. You can do that in like a ramp test, and you can establish your VT1, your VT2, your VO2 max. You can delineate your zones that way in a sort of a somewhat static way, right? Like you do a test and you get these results, and that creates your zones. But then breathing as this new way to understand the stress on the body gives us a completely different view of how much stress at a given time we're applying to the body, and how and it's telling us a different signal, or different it's giving us different information than what heart rate and or power is giving us. And so you might have significant heart rate drift on one day with stable ventilation. That's going to be telling us a very different thing than the same day when you have moderate drift, but ventilation is going along with it. That's a different stressor, and so it can help us kind of tease apart what's actually going on with the individual, and understand the stress that's being applied, and then on the back end of that, we can then measure. Okay, did your thresholds improve? What were all the stressors that led to the change that we're observing, or we're able to measure? And so it gives us this sort of like kind of, book ending, and also all the books in the middle to understand, you know, what's the starting point, what happens in the middle, and then how did you change? And we can compare them. We can then say like, okay, you adapted really well to this, or you didn't adapt very well, and it's all N of one. It's all just you. It's not like,
Yeah.
you as an average of the population. We're assuming that you have XYZ traits, and therefore, you're gonna we're gonna assume you respond in this way. No, it's just like, here's your starting point. Here's what happened. Here's how it ended, and then we can make decisions based on that. Then we can take that N of one and compare it to kind of other populations. Like, is this a high response or a low response compared to where we've seen in other places? That's a totally different conversation than using getting a baseline that is based on population averages. And so with ventilation, we can completely flip this whole model around of saying, like, using heart rate zones, which are usually based on averages based on the population, and they have very wide error margins. So we don't really know where you actually are, but we get maybe an first order approximation of where you should be, and then a good coach can kind of work with that and sort of fine tune that model. But as an individual who doesn't know how to fine tune that model, you're kind of up shit's creek a bit, and you don't really know what's happening, what's improving, what's changing, and so forth. And so you can kind of get lost in the weeds. And I think that's a big thing that we see, is there's just like the simplicity when you just know where you are. Like you'd literally just get a measurement, like, this is my fitness level, this is what I do to
Yeah.
improve it. It can't be simpler than that. The complexity comes in when we're trying to fit these like square pegs into round holes of, like, using all these crazy formulas and this estimations, and we're gonna correct for this and that, and because of XYZ parameters, and like, that's when it really gets complicated. We're kind of like, we're trying to be too smart, but we're just using the wrong data, and that's really where it comes down to. Kind of, that's fundamentally, that's where I see ventilation playing such a big role, is that it cuts through a lot of that noise and just allows us to measure the individual, how they respond, and it's really simple.
We have 3 long form podcasts every week. Some of them are 90 minutes or 2 hours long. And I realize you're busy. Sometimes it's hard to cut through the noise and figure out the signal, figure out what the important parts are of these conversations. So I've taken your feedback, and once a week I'm delivering to your inbox a newsletter called The Saturday Spin. It's a 4-minute read or less, and it's going to break down the very best thing I've learned on the podcast this week. So it's insights from the biggest names in the world tour, physiologists, sports psychologists, and coaches. It's completely free to sign up to the newsletter. All you have to do is go to roadmancycling.com, stick in your email address, and once a week on a Saturday morning, I will deliver the Saturday Spin newsletter direct to your inbox. The link is down below. Go sign up.